What I'm hoping to accomplish in this video is to clear up some confusion, very understandable confusion. I'm perfectly willing to admit that we don't really know exactly what these things refer to, but we do have a set of words associated with these things. And the tendency is to think, well, okay, this is thunder, okay, here in the prenatal, over here in the postnatal. When we label it thunder, what we're asking ourselves is, why is this configuration like thunder? And the tendency is to say, well, this is thunder. We've labeled it as such. This is lake. Here's lake in the prenatal. Here it is in the postnatal. And so this must be like a lake in some way or another, right? And it's very difficult to not materialize that, to say, well, in what way is this like a lake? And we forget then that actually the lake is the thing that is like something else. In other words, particularly in a poetic language, and I think it's fair to say that traditional Chinese is a deeply poetic language. You know, the basic symbols have all kinds of resonances and meanings, and that's what poetry is. It's a web of meaning. And the meaning is not the word, right? The meaning is something that lies underneath the word. So when you read poetry, it's not like a logical operation performed on the basis of an analysis of the words. You know, it's what you do is you start to get an image of underlying meaning. So the referent of this object, which is not a word, it's a symbol, right? That referent is some meaning. Similarly, when we say lake, that's not the meaning that's being assigned. This is not about a lake. A lake is about this, and this is about something else. And what I'm suggesting is that what it's about is a state of mind. And here's the model that I'm proposing. So when we say lake, what we're referring to are the yang lines in the bottom and middle position and the yin line on the top. In this model, that suggests that there is a tension placed on the imagination and on the sense, and not on the memory. That's what I'm proposing. So when we're thinking about the story of the Bagua, we think about it in terms of these mind states. That's fundamentally what's being suggested. In what way is this state of mind like fire? In what way is it like clinging? In what way is it like brightness? These associated terms. So it's poetry. We're not talking about the phenomena of fire. We're not talking about a physical thing. We're talking about a description of states of mind. So it's difficult to not want to associate these with physical phenomena, but it's not really fundamentally what's being talked about here. In order to get to the basics of what's being proposed, we have to put aside the idea that this is referring to physical phenomena and think entirely of consciousness. And each of these terms is, in essence, a description of the different configurations within consciousness. And so the reason why fire is associated with this is because when you have imagination and memory without sense. So what is fire? What is the desire? I'm calling it desire. That's my own word. But okay, we're calling it clinging fire, this burning that creates a brightness, right? Well, what is it that's basically burning inside of us if it isn't the object in the mind and the imagination of the fulfillment, like imbuing the object with all of this significance. A cherished object in the mind is the thing that drives us forward. It doesn't matter what the object is. It could be a person, it could be an object, it could be a experience, right? So some people are motivated by food, some people are motivated by sex, some people are motivated by prestige, some people are motivated by money. All of these are objects in the mind that drive us. And it's like a burning within us.
And like all burning, it produces a brightness. And of course, brightness is something that makes things visible. So the image becomes more bright. And we're attracted to bright and shiny things, like moths to the flame. And if you look at the model is saying that what we have here is yang in the top and bottom position. So that's memory and imagination. So you have an object in memory that's being polished by the imagination to make it ever more bright, ever more desirable, ever more something that you're going to cling to and run after.
And so the actual presence of it is not there. So this sense, when we desire something, the example I use all the time is like a cup of coffee. I wonder why. Very mundane example. It could be a billion things. Obviously, it could be a person, right? Sexual partner. It could be acclaim and fame and blah, blah, blah. You name it. Whatever it is that object stored in memory, right? You don't have it right now. If you're desiring it, if you're running after it, if your imagination is running wild on it and trying to give you all these different strategies for how to achieve it, it's by definition not within your grasp. This is the yin line in fire, right? Here's fire. Let's go to postnatal at the top. It's a state of mind. It's not fire. Fire is a description. Okay, I've flogged that to death. Now, let's talk about what do these arrangements mean. Let's talk about another possible metaphor, right? So each one of these is like, it's a metaphor. Earth, receptive. These are descriptions of this mind state. Now I'm going to use a metaphor for the whole thing, for this cycle. We can think of this as like a state of being. You have your prenatal and your postnatal state of being. And the root of the prenatal state of being is emptiness, receptivity. The root of the prenatal is a yin line in all three positions. That means, in essence, that no attention is being placed anywhere. That's why it's called receptive. A receiver is something that is as relaxed as possible so that it can receive the finest signals. The most balanced and finest instruments of sensory capability are ones that don't generate signals. There's no tension in them. They are essentially able to, you could say, vibrate with even the finest fluctuation in whatever field of signals they're operating within. Now you can make the argument that if it's too fine, if the receptivity is too great, then you can't differentiate the noise from the signal. And I think that's a very interesting issue to ponder. But for the purposes of this video, let's assume it to be a pure state of empty receptivity. You can think of this as being like the deepest sleep, where there is essentially no awareness. So there's no intention. You're not trying. That doesn't mean that things don't arise. As a matter of fact, the very next thing in this thing is the arousal. Something arises. What? It's in the imagination. So think about, like, on a somewhat mundane level, you could say, well, this pattern is kind of like a daily cycle. So here's your sleep. You're like a bear, you hibernate. Maybe it's like sleep overnight. Maybe it's sleep for like the annual sleep for hibernation like a bear, or maybe it's like Brahma, where like this, it's cycles of many hundreds of thousands of years, and like this is the moment of emptiness before the first thing, which is the imagination. It's before the rising line. So remember, here it's the east, it's the rising side. So in the metaphor, this is kind of before the rising. So it's like you've been sleeping all winter and something arises within you. It's like you woke up, but you haven't yet stirred. You're kind of just lying there. And this is like the dream state. You know, Brahma, of course, is the dreamer, right? Within which everything is occurring. So this is connected to that sense. And of course, within that completely receptive zone is all possibility. Because if you're not receptive, well, then there's no possibility. And here's the possibility showing up. It's some imagination, which is why it's tied to the future. Remember, the original model was future down here, and I'm kind of avoiding that now because I think it makes things more confusing. But it's without a doubt that you can think of the imagination as being the thing which gives us a sense of what is possible. And that, of course, is the realm of the future. Oh, and I will avoid confusion by commenting on that in the way that I ordinarily would. So here we are, that sense of possibility. What actually happens now? Well, it's stored in memory. And so that means that now we have a vision. This is just a possibility, right? But now there's a vision because we can return to it. Memory and imagination. You can have imagination that never turns into memory, and it's just like it comes and it goes. I'm sure we've all experienced that, particularly those of us who like to think about things. You know, you have like a flash of insight, and then you can't remember what it was. It didn't get stored. In this case, it is stored, and on some level, it has to be stored in order for things to move along. Because if it isn't stored, it's gone. Here you are. Something new aroused came up in your imagination, and then you're able to return to it. And there's still that kind of imaginative development, but it ain't actually happening yet. Here's what's happening. Bringing it into actual activity. The senses are involved in it in one way or another. So it's like, here's where you started building it. This was just like a little wisp of a notion. Here is, oh, now it's taking on a life inside of the mind. Memory and imagination. But you haven't started doing anything yet. Now you're doing something with it. It's developing. And in a way, like the memory of it isn't as important because you're dealing with the contingencies of what happens when you develop things. And there's a kind of joyousness to it. And I'm going to say that the joyousness is because you're basically still abiding by, you know, your goal is heaven. In other words, the goal is not the self. In the postnatal, that's really more about the goal being about the self, about you being able to get what you want, because that's why fire is up here at the top. You have an object in your mind and you have the imagination, you're trying to achieve that, right? But in the prenatal, the goal is really unification. It's like yoga, right? Yoga means unification. And so the sense of joyousness in building something that was like, it's given to you as a gift. You didn't do anything to get this imagination to be aroused in that way. You were empty. That's the root of the whole thing. In other words, you're like, you're humbly submitting to the universe. And you're given a gift of some sort of an idea and you remember it. And then you start to like practice it, you could say. And you don't have to remember it because it's already inside of you. It's like when you practice a instrument. You can't think about it when you're performing it. You're not like actively intending to remember the music. It's just, you're just playing the music. It's like, yeah, you know how it goes, but your intention is not there. You just know how the music goes. So you don't have to put your intention there. Right? Because remember, just because there's a yin line doesn't mean nothing's happening there. In a way, like, how could you ever shut down any one of these faculties within consciousness? Now, you can place your attention at any one of them, and that's what I'm saying the yang line indicates. But can you shut off any one of these? I don't think so. So yin is just like, well, that's not what I'm thinking about right now. It's not what I'm doing. That explains why this is kind of the development of the realization, let's say, of the creative. Because here, time is essentially unified. You could say that all three things come together. It all comes together when it makes its entrance on the universal stage. And here's where it gets really interesting. Well, it's all really interesting, right? But from then on, it's like this is the descending side, right? Because we're on the west, right? So the descending side happens as a consequence of heaven. So we're basically we're reaching for whatever like evolutionary development needs to occur, and then it's on the world stage, right? Prior to that, it's just an imagination thing that gets stored in the memory, and then you're developing it. But it hasn't yet like gotten released. It doesn't have you're just like doing the code. You're doing the code work, right? And then all of a sudden, it's out in the world, some way or another. It's become a thing, right? And now it plays itself out within the world. So you don't have that imaginative aspect of it anymore, right? That's not the thing that's going on. After the release, you could say this is the after effect of the creation showing up. So yeah, there's a preservation memory of what it was, and there's a kind of activity sense in the present, but it's no longer developing. It's just like the wind. The wind is like a variety of pressure mediations that happen as a result of temperature differences and what have you, the heating of the sun, all that. It's an after effect of creative activity. And then what happens? Well, as the wind goes through all of the various things, then the waters are affected. You could think of it like, so in the cosmos, when something new comes into being, the message of that, you could say it's like the Holy Ghost, or it's the in the case of our immediate solar system, it's the solar wind, literally what we call it. And then everything that gets hit by that wind, it's flowing with it. It has that kind of a impact on the objects within the field. This is sort of like the energy within the field, and these are the objects within the field kind of resonating with this gust of wind. And then at the end of it, it's just a memory of something that happened. It's still significant, but that wind has gotten played out, and the things reconfigured themselves as water does. So if we're going to tell the story in more cosmological terms, we'll say, well, let's talk about the formation of a universe, right? If there's a beginning, and I guess that's always a question, but let's say that there is some sort of beginning. Big Bang, right? That suggests there's a beginning. The Brahma story, well, there's a cycle, and that suggests that there's a beginning. So here we are before the beginning. Nothing's happened. It's empty. Then there's just sort of an idea. And that idea gets stored. It's developed, and then it comes into being. And that being then plays itself into phenomena. Whatever's there gets rearranged as a result of it. And then that cycle is just a memory, and it occurs recursively all the time. Every time something new shows up on the stage, it's like an energetic release that has an effect on the configuration of the material, and then it's like, yeah, it's played its role, but it's just a memory, and it gets tossed on the mountain of events that make up history and the things that aren't part of history, basically all past events. That's why I like time is while it confuses things, it is, I think, helpful in getting a sense of what's being talked about here. Okay, so that's the prenatal. And the other thing about the prenatal, I'd say, is that when this is the state of mind, well, this position of rest is fundamental to it. It's like the fundamental. It is the root. Not the case in the postnatal. In the postnatal, water, that present sense, sensory indulgence is the root. The ever, you could say that these two things are interlocked, and that's another kind of story about how the opposition of mind states are co-creating and interlocked. It's another factor that's definitely worth thinking about. So, desire is the desire to have a sensory experience, whether it's sex, drugs, or rock and roll, or anything else that's an object stored within the mind that the imaginative process is running wild on. It's because there's the sense, right? The sense that that this might be achieved. Maybe you had a great experience before or something. Maybe you had a great sex, drugs, or rock and roll experience, and you remember it, and your imagination is like, yeah, I want some more of that. So here you go, the root and the goal. But you'll notice that, like, in the root, there's no rest. It's just this sensory kind of vibrating. And that prior to this, you've got heaven. Yeah. Like, why would that be the case? What's heaven doing there on the descending side right before we hit you could call it the low point. It's the northern point, the baseline, the root, all these terms, origin, if you like. What's heaven doing here? Why is the creative all the way down at the end of the cycle before we get down to that root point? There's a number of ways of thinking about it. We think of humanity now as being a very restless species. So, for example, in New York, those of us who have experienced New York, the city that never sleeps. Is it a coincidence that happens to be the city that kind of is emblematic of modernity? Everyone is trying to get what they want. And there's a fundamental restlessness. Now, at the end of the cycle, you're like trying to get what you want. It's a big deal. It's like what everything's all about. You're working up to it. It always ends up being kind of empty. It doesn't really fulfill. So you engage in various forms of activity, sense indulgence, with the imagination that it's actually fulfilling you, but it ain't quite the thing that you imagined. It's really not what you had in mind. You had in mind this freaking awesome, brilliant, bright, just unbelievably cool future of like the perfect thing that really motivated all of this activity. And we'll talk about the coming on upside. But for now, like, let's just consider how incredible we can polish this memory object. Whether it's a particular person who we idolized and just yearned after for years, or whether it's, the awesomeness of some particular food, drug, drink experience, whatever it is, like amusement ride or anything that you're hoping to somehow or another recapture, you can turn that into this unbelievable image, right? Really chase after it, and it's always going to disappoint because it's never going to be as good as you've polished it up to be. And then you're going to end up with this kind of thing that passes for, well, at least I got something out of it. You're going to indulge sensorily with a kind of an imaginative process, even if it ain't quite what it was you were looking for, quite definitely not what you were looking for. And that just gets worse and worse over time, right? So this is a description of a kind of descent into hell, I'd say, the postnatal, if this is the only ride that you know. And what is this heaven doing down here? Well, the creative, right, is like, it's like that feeling of, you had a day, it was kind of punishing, you went through it in the hopes of being able to achieve this thing, but it kind of didn't work out, and like you ended up with whatever scraps were available to you, and like this was like that moment before you're going to try to go to sleep where you're just not satisfied with what happened, and you feel the need, like, I got to change this, I got to do something different, this ain't working. And then you can't really rest because you're in that mode of like feeling disturbed, and it's all because it's chasing after some particular object. That's what's happening. I mean, this is what all the spiritual traditions have been telling us, right? I mean, this is not new news, right? The only thing I'm saying is that I think that the story is being encoded, and it's being encoded in a very particular way, and it describes what's going on in the mind. What's this one? We got to remember, this is mountain. It's sort of like when you have a restless night, you wake up with the memory of like all the kind of trauma that you went through, I guess you could say, really, because in this case that's what it is, you know. In the other case, it's like you're not waking up with trauma, right? You're waking up with a sense of hope and potential, something new every day, right? In this one, it's like, no, damn, I'm gonna have to go through this again. That's what you're waking up with. What's this here? In order to get yourself going, you have to have the sense that there's some sort of imaginative potentiality. Like, let's say you're in a situation where, you know, you've been working 15, 20 years at a job and it ain't going where you want it to go. You still got to have some kind of a sense of possibility in order to get up and do it again. Why does it go to wind? Well, wind is repeating what happened before. Memory, sense, or past and present. You go back, Jack, do it again. Wheel turning round and round. So you could say on some level, like, this is fulfilling your destiny. This one is not fulfilling your destiny. What does that mean? Well, sometimes it's like the thing that you're chasing after that you want. Sometimes it's what other people want. Like someone else put an object in there that you have some imaginative operation on that drives you forward. I mean, after all, where did these ideas come from, right? They didn't come from nowhere. It would be better if they came from nowhere, because that's the root of all this stuff. Honestly, I would say that's the root of this entire YouTube channel. So not fulfilling destiny is not doing what you were meant to do and doing instead what you were told to do without believing it necessarily, or by becoming addicted to something that you know is something that you really shouldn't be doing. When you're doing something you know you shouldn't be doing, this is what you experience. And that's not fulfilling your destiny. If you find your way to what you know is correct, this is your experience. Now, there's about 1 billion different manifestations of all these different things. You could say there's 1 billion different manifestations of each one of these states of mind, trigram, right? It can refer to any number of things. I would say it refers to all things. When it comes to consciousness, you're either going to be here or you're going to be here. And quite often, if you're like most of us, you'll kind of go back and forth between the two. Now, ideally, as you learn, you'll spend more time here. And if you don't learn, you'll end up being punished by going around in this kind of karmic cycle for a long time until you just can't take it no more. Ultimately, I think it would be safe to say that this is serving some greater purpose. That it's not just self-interest, that you're interested in the mandate of heaven, which basically means, well, what's going to be best for creation? What's going to be best for the cosmos we're living in? What's going to be best for the world? What's going to be best for my family? What's going to be best for the people I'm involved with? What's going to be best for the creatures around us? You're always kind of concerned with that. Here, you're not concerned with that. What's going to be good for me? What's going to be good for you? To not be here. What's going to be good for you is to be here, where you're not worried about what's good for you. When you're here and you're worried about what's good for you, what you want, well, it's empty. And what does it lead to? It leads to a sense of like, this ain't what I want. It's joyous, right? Yeah, it ain't what you want, though. It's down here in the West. And then you're trying to figure out, what can I do differently? But you're still trying to get what you want. What can you do differently? Don't be attached to the sense phenomena. Don't be attached to the mind objects. Reside in emptiness and love God. That's it. It's outrageously simple. So I think that's basically everything I wanted to say. I hope that that's going to clear up some confusion and misunderstanding. I imagine that probably it won't. I have to wonder the extent to which, when I'm making these videos, I'm engaged in a postnatal cycle. Well, because I want to express this, it seems like it's worth expressing. Is that a good idea to do? I mean, in some level, it does result in emptiness. And I do think, okay, well, maybe I could do it better. Right? That's why I'm making this video. Would I make a video in this state of being? I don't know. I mean, get rest, and then I have this like thing in, a sense of possibility that turns into something, and then, is it serving the mandate of heaven? Like, is this going to make things better for people? Is the world going to be improved in some way or another by this? I honestly don't know. Maybe it won't. But let's say, I didn't make a video. And I just kept it to myself. I mean, I'm having these thoughts anyway, right? I've been thinking about it for 20 years, something like that. So the thoughts have been helpful. I was not a happy puppy. Definitely not a happy puppy. Very much trapped in this. Very much like running after this and finding emptiness and just like kind of dulling the pain with whatever kind of so-called joyous. I think this is a sarcastic kind of joyousness over here in the West, in the postnatal, and then feeling the urgency of having to find some different way of being. How could I describe it without having spent so much time here? And like after a while, things like occurred to me, I realized the futility of my trying to come up with it myself. And I ultimately ended up spending a fair amount of time kind of going, okay, well, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And then something occurred to me and it got stuck in my head. And I thought, well, I better work on that and see whether or not it brings something about that would be beneficial. Now, I have yet to see what the consequences of that are and whether or not it resonates with others and whether or not it actually ends up like, is this something that's making its way into the world that's going to change things? I don't know. It might. I mean, I don't know. I'm here. This is my home. Do I still spend time here? Yeah. Yeah, I do. But now, if I'm here or here, I can't help but recognize that that's a choice, and I could be here, and I could have this as my sense of possibility. Well, sense of possibility would be here, but I have this as like the aspiration for fulfillment, that somehow or another I would be playing a role in the fulfillment of something that's good. And so that seems like it's, well, I can talk to the people around me about this, but I'll tell you, no one's interested in it. My family's not interested in it. My life partner is, not all that interested in it. She'll put up with it if I have to talk about it, but she's not that interested. Are there people interested out there? Yeah, there's some. Some people are interested in this. So I don't know what it all adds up to, but I hope that was helpful. I know it was more long-winded than it needed to be. That's just the way I am. I don't know how to be all that succinct. I don't know how to be organized in a way that doesn't cause me a great amount of stress. Making that first video took a long time, and it was definitely this feeling. I really felt the need to capture the idea. Even though I understood that there was the potential for this, the experience that I was having was this. It was stressful. It was not restful. And so I found this new way of making videos and not really thinking too much about what I'm going to say, except like there's an idea that shows up. And if it takes on a life inside of me, then I'm like, well, I better work on it. And then I'll release it and see what happens. So I hope it's coherent to some, and, I guess for those who don't find it coherent, well, maybe watch other videos. That's always something you could do. If you want to support this channel, you know what to do. There are links available to those of you, the few of you who still have financial resources to throw around, and I do appreciate the few of you who do that, throwing that in this direction. But if you don't have stuff to throw around and you'd like to help out, well, you may know some people who would find this interesting, and perhaps you might bring it to their attention. And even if not, you can hit a like button, write a comment, all that kind of stuff that the interwebby people want us to do, right? I appreciate your time, and I'll just say goodbye then. Adios.